Because given what you're up against, given the habit pattern of thinking, given the identification with the mind and with the body and with the thought activity, to come out of that, to transform your experience, to come out of that and to experience the natural state, to be happy, is something that you're not going to do. It's something that will happen. But the only way it'll happen is if the time that you spend in the thinking process, identified with the body and identified with the person, identified with the thinking, identified with the emotions, identified with the circumstances. The only way that that's going to happen is there has to be a motivation that's strong enough. We talk about the word commitment. There has to be a motivation that's strong enough that will support you in the need for consistent awareness. You have to have the motivation that will support you in the need for paying attention. Because part of the trance that we suffer from is that not only is there a misunderstanding and an ongoing, perpetual misunderstanding about who we are, but we live our lives in a thought activity. And when things happen that stimulate strong emotion, fear, anger, frustration, the intensity of the thinking activity rises. The intensity of the thinking activity rises. The intensity of the identification with thinking increases. The tendency to not only identify with the thought activity, but to identify with the character that's part of this activity, to identify with the person that this activity continually generates. And when there's intense emotion, and the activation of the nervous system for fight or flight or freeze gets stimulated, it's much more difficult to stay conscious, to stay awake, because you're under the gun, so to speak. You know, when you get thoroughly in character, when you're thoroughly in character, part of the experience of being thoroughly in character is that the drama of that character and the story that the character is involved with appear to be very real. And this is so much the case that there's no way out. It is, you are compelled to act as the character. And this happens immediately. This happens completely. You are completely, when you're angry, for example, and you act out that anger, whether it's be through something you say or something you do, you're completely involved with the thinking, with the thought activity. You're completely involved with the emotional material. You could say that you're completely identified with the thinking and with the emotions. And the way it all occurs to you is, I think, I feel, you did this to me, and you're hurting me. You know, you're threatening me. You're treating me unfairly. You're making me angry. You're confusing me. You're upsetting me. Or you could say, life is disturbing. Life is upsetting. Life is confusing. Life is causing me fear. Life is causing me frustration. Life is causing me upset. And so when that's the case, you're in that world. When that's the case, you're in the movie. You're not in the audience, you're in the movie. And the drama is real, and you are in the drama, and you are the person. This is the situation. And this is also the reason why people, when they look at these things and consider meditation and practice meditation, right, it is often the case and common for people to say that I understand the teachings, I'm even convinced of the teachings, but I don't experience what they point to. I don't experience the freedom, the liberation, the happiness, the well-being, the contentment, the satisfaction, the peace of mind. I don't experience this. I understand it. It makes sense to me. I can see when I look at it. I can see what it points to. I can see how it is when it doesn't work. If I pay attention, I can watch my life not working. I can watch myself being ignorant. I can watch myself misbehaving. I can watch myself suffer. Oh, practice. Maybe that explains why we sat here for the last 25 minutes. Right? Why would people do that? Why would people sit still and be silent for periods of time like that, especially given what goes on when you're doing it, right? That the thinking process starts to demand your attention, doesn't it? Why would you do that? That in and of itself is a form of masochism, isn't it? Sitting there like that, doing that. Well, the thing is this, what are you practicing when you're practicing that? If you simply move attention away from the thinking activity and pay attention to the breath and the body, when you are attending, when you are being that awareness, being aware of the breath and the body, are you in the thinking activity? No. And what's the source of suffering?
Thinking.
Well, that's the shorthand version of it. I was going to get to that, but the first answer to that is the source of suffering, expecting things to be different, isn't it? Yeah, that's the source of suffering. And where does that expecting occur? In the thinking activity, I was going to get to that next. But first, I want to be clear that the kind of thinking that is the source of the suffering is thinking that things should be different. And since all of thinking is an interpretation, since all of thinking is not an accurate reflection of what's happening, then what, if anything, could be different that would make a difference? It would be thinking differently, wouldn't it? But do you have any choice? Obviously, you don't have any choice unless you think you're thinking, but I thought we already did that chapter. So thinking happens. Thinking continues to happen. It's called the default state. Thinking happens. It continues to happen. It's called the default state. And part of the thinking that happens when thinking is happening is thinking that you're thinking. And part of what happens when thinking is happening is thinking that what you think is true. Isn't it? Yeah. And when thinking is happening and there's no awareness of thinking as thinking, when thinking is happening and there's no awareness of thinking as thinking, is thinking happening? When thinking's happening and there is no awareness of thinking as thinking when thinking is happening, is thinking happening? If there's no awareness of thinking as thinking when thinking is happening, thinking isn't happening, what's happening? These are the distinctions that have to be there for you to sort your way, for you to sort it out, for you to get out of the confusion about it all. And so it's worthwhile to get into these fine points and really look. If thinking is happening and there's no awareness of thinking as thinking when thinking is happening, is thinking happening? It seems to be, that seems to be one of those koans, right? Yeah. And if you look, what you'll see is that no, thinking's not happening. If thinking is happening in the light of awareness, if thinking is happening and thinking is being recognized as thinking when it's happening, then thinking is happening. But if thinking is not recognized as thinking when it's happening, as the thinking activity happening, and you're identified with the thinking activity, then is thinking activity happening? If you're identified with thinking, is thinking activity happening? Yeah. Because it's not thinking happening. If there's no awareness of thinking as thinking happening, it's not thinking happening. It's you thinking, isn't it? If you're not aware of thinking as thinking happening, if you're not aware of the thinking activity as a thinking activity, then what's happening is not a thinking activity, it's you thinking. Isn't it? Because unless you identify with thinking, unless the thinking activity is one in which you exist, there can be no suffering, because the you that would suffer is part of what is being thought. The you that is suffering is being generated by thinking, right? If you're not in the thinking activity and the awareness is there, paying attention to the breath in the body, there can be no suffering, because there's no one to suffer. All there is, if you really look, all there is when you're practicing meditation, meaning that you're being aware of the breath in the body, all there is being aware of the breath in the body. When you're being aware of the breath of the body, when the awareness is aware of the breath in the body, all there is the awareness and the breath in the body. Yes? Yeah. Is there a sufferer? She said, as you go through the day, and she's right, as you go through the day, things will happen that will stimulate reactions. Things will happen that will stimulate thinking. Things will happen that will stimulate behavior. All of that goes on, and when all that goes on, you identify with it. You identify with the circumstances. You identify with the thinking and the feeling, and the interactions and the behavior and confusion and the upset, and you're trying to get it to work, and then. So how do you get out of that?
Go back to the breath.
How do you go back to the breath? I mean, I think she knows that, right? But she's saying, okay, go back to the breath. But what I'm finding to be so is, in the course of my daily life, at the end of the day, I end up noticing that more than not, it continues to be the same. I continue to suffer. I continue to behave the same way. For the most part, I continue to have habits. I continue to identify with time, with the past, with my body, with thinking. In order for this to work, the first thing that has to happen is you've got to be able to pay attention such that you notice. You've got to be able to pay attention such that you notice when you're going into your head, when you're being the person, when you're being the separate self. If you don't notice you're being the separate self, you don't stand a chance. Yeah, so the first thing you have to do is you've got to be able to notice that you're in the separate self. You got to be able to notice that you are in a mental state, that there is a thinking activity occurring that's intensified by how you feel, right? Or intensified by the circumstances you find yourself in. You've got to be able to pay attention and notice when that occurs. So what will allow you to pay attention and notice when that occurs? You are no longer identified with being the thinker of the thoughts, but you are aware of thinking. Might it not be the case that when you practice meditation and you're practicing being aware of the body rather than identifying with the body, that you're practicing what you would need to practice to be aware of thinking rather than I am thinking? Do you follow this?
Yeah, it's the same.
Yeah, it's the same thing, isn't it? Yeah. So what's the practice? So what's the answer to your question? Practice what? You, in order to notice notice awareness and to be that awareness and to have that awareness shine on what's happening, to have that awareness be aware of the breath, be aware of the body, be aware of the mind, be aware of thinking, be aware of whatever it's aware of. Right? Something has to happen because, as you said, in the normal course of events for most people, it doesn't just happen like that. You know, you can't. It's not like I give you the answer and you just do that, right? I could tell you, oh, here's the answer. As you're going through your day, be aware of the thinking activity and notice when there's strong emotions when you're going through your day, and when that happens, notice that you're not thinking the thoughts. Notice that you're the awareness of the thinking activity, not the person that the thinking activity is generating. Just do that, okay? You got the script, you got the prescription, do that and come back and tell me how you're doing. Is that going to work? No. You know why it's not going to work? Well, you know it's not going to work because you've obviously, like most people, have attempted, right? Yeah. Well, that might be the way it occurs, but I promise you it's not because you notice. Don't forget, we're going to end up back in the same rut as we always end up in. You're the doer, right? And the doer is now going to do something. The doer is now going to notice, right? Well, we already know that's a dead end, right? So don't make me go there. This is very interesting because this is the illusion. This is how we get sucked into the illusion. Here's the deal. When you notice what you weren't noticing before, when you notice when you're in the thinking activity, when you notice you're identified with the thinking, when you notice you're identified with the emotions, right? And when, because you notice that, you don't follow it, it doesn't run the show, your behavior doesn't come from there, right? When that happens, when you notice, it just happens. It just happens. Well, how does that happen? How does that just happen? You notice, all of a sudden you notice that you're in an interaction with somebody and they're an important person in your life, so their ability to upset you is pretty high, right? They can upset you pretty easily, right? Somebody you're really close to, all they have to do is look at you. All they have to do is not do something and you're upset. They don't even have to do something, right? Right? So when that happens, and in the middle of that happening, all of a sudden you notice that there is a thinking activity going on and you are identifying with the thinking activity that's going on. And when you notice that it's a thinking activity and you notice that you're identified with it, you now have the space not to be determined by it. And you can now actually be present in such a way where you see it, you see what's going on. But going back to what I said earlier, not because you did anything, it just happened. Here's the point. This is a, you know, what we're talking about here is very dangerous. What we're talking about here is very dangerous because it's like looking at the programming, right? And that which believes the programming is the truth will start to get a little unnerved about this. Oh, looking at the programming. But it just happens. When you notice what you weren't noticing before, it just happens. Well, how does that happen that it just happens? I hope you get this, because if you get this, if you really get this, and because you get this, it increases your motivation, it could really make a difference, right? It just happens because you've been practicing in meditation, you've been practicing the experience of not being in the thinking activity, haven't you? Yeah, and as you practice that more and more consistently, guess what? It starts happening, doesn't it? Yes, it starts happening. You're not doing anything. It just starts happening. You just notice that instead of fighting what you can't win, you simply notice what's going on and allow things to happen, continue to happen, consistent with the way they are. And when things happen consistent with the way they are, things happen perfectly, just like they're supposed to, don't they? Yeah. So the takeaway here is practicing meditation is the whole deal. Because as you do that and you strengthen the grounding in the truth, as you go through your life, that will start to become more apparent, more often start to become more apparent. And when it becomes more apparent, and when you see what's really going on, and when, because you see what's going on, you don't get involved with acting it out, and things work out better, right? Now you have some motivation to get some momentum. Now you want more, right? Now you want more of that because you notice that you didn't fight that fight. You didn't suffer that suffering. This is very important. So then meditation, if you see what I'm pointing to, meditation doesn't just become a formal practice that you do when you're here. I said to somebody, oh, it's irrelevant. But it becomes a way of life because you understand the connection between meditation and freedom. So it doesn't just become a formal thing, it becomes something that if you understand, the more you do that, the higher the probability that you'll spend more time in truth. So the practice of that should start to become something that's not just formal, consistent, but not just formal. As you're going through your life, train yourself, right? Train yourself that whenever you begin to notice strong emotions arising, whenever you begin to notice that you feel compelled to act out, or you feel anxious, or you feel depressed, right? If at that time you move your attention to the breath, when you move your attention to the breath, you are extricating yourself from the thinking activity. When you move your attention to the breath, you're extricating yourself from the thought process, from the thinking activity, and now you can see it from where you are, from who you really are, instead of being in the middle of the movie, believing the movie is the truth. And you can do this. This is informal practice. This is consistently practicing meditation as a way of living. And if you do that with consistency, over time there'll be more and more time that you spend awake, alive, happy, content, and satisfied. It'll just happen. In spite of you. Not because of you. Okay, have a good evening.
Sure.